It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And at any time you have any questions, please interrupt. I've had the pleasure to be able to speak to a number of different organizations, utilities, national labs on the topic of delivering the nuclear promise. And I always find that the initial communication that came out back in 2015 when the initiative was created and kicked off, there wasn't a whole lot of communication that gave the reasoning and background and issues. So I'll be covering some of that today, as well as the progress that's been made along with that. Now, whenever I talk about the nuclear promise, I like to make sure that everyone understands what is the nuclear promise. And that nuclear promise goes back to post-World War II and a speech by President Dwight Eisenhower on to the United Nations on Atoms for Peace. And in that speech, President Eisenhower talked about the abundance of safe, reliable, and economic electricity as that promise of the nuclear era or commercial nuclear power. Its promise would be to provide that abundant, safe, reliable, and economic electrical generation. So when you hear about the nuclear promise, it really involves three characteristics, and that's safe, reliable, and economic. In both safety and reliability, I can tell you those promises are delivered. When you look at any objective metrics associated with industrial safety, you'll find that nuclear industry stands far above any other industry in safety. As far as reliability as well, in reliability. But so two of those three promises have been met. The promise that's not been met is economic. And quite frankly, that economic promise not being met is making it so that the nuclear industry is in a fight for survival. And I know that will sound dramatic. Chris is being overly dramatic, but it's really true. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, before I get into the delivering the nuclear promise background and some of those issues, I'd like to show, what is the impact, what is the effect of the nuclear industry on the United States at the current time. So when we look at it, and nuclear generates nearly 20% of US electricity, and that's been fairly constant, even with the ups and downs that have occurred. I would say over 30 years, we've been right about that 20% level. What's changed significantly is the distribution between coal and natural gas, as well as the uptick in wind and solar. Now, nuclear supplies more than half of the emissions-free electricity. So you see, these are 2019 values coming from the U.S. Energy and Information Administration, where that carbon-free emissions, 54.8% provided by nuclear. When we look at the emissions avoided by the industry, it really comes out to about 100 million cars. So all of this is really just going to what is the impact, the effect of the nuclear industry on the United States currently. You see here, we have 95 reactors at 56 different sites across the US. We look at the value once again, adding $60 billion to the country's gross domestic product, supporting almost 500,000 jobs, 10 billion in federal and 2.2 billion in state taxes each year. And then, of course, on the climate change front, it avoids over 500 million tons of carbon emissions each year. Now, when I talked about nuclear being in a fight for survival and that it's really not dramatic, this slide is meant to show that. When we fail to meet the economic promise of nuclear, we see that just since 2013, we've had 10 nuclear reactors be shut down prematurely, and 5 are announced. So we're looking at 5 upcoming and 10 already been closed. And these were plants that had decades left on their operating licenses, decades worth of CO2 avoidance. So that's the current impact of the nuclear industry on the United States, where we stand. Now, to talk about why we're not meeting that third nuclear promise of economic generation, I need to go back and I want to cover with you nuclear power through the decades. We go back to looking at the lower part of this infographic. The first commercial nuclear power plant was in Shippingport, Pennsylvania, started in the late 1950s, went online. The 1960s were, following Shippingport, the 1960s were a time of high optimism. Optimism that nuclear was going to make it so electricity was too cheap to meter. We had numerous construction projects going on. There were 21 nuclear reactors started up during the 1960s. Now you'll see also in that infographic, I talk about 6 reactors shut down during this decade. You'll find that in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there were, coincidentally enough, 6 reactors shut down each decade. Those were initial kind of test reactors, that first generation, and that's why that they shut down with very little operation. But once again, 21 reactors started in the 1960s. When we go to the 70s, it's still a continued time of optimism. And in fact, there were approximately 250 reactors on order in the 1970s. Now, 59 reactors were started up. So in a 10-year period, we started up 59 reactors. That was actually incredible. And moving on, so all of that, the optimism and everything continued until the 3 Mile Island Unit 2 accident in March of 1979. With that accident and the changes that came out of it, we saw in the 1980s a sharp rise in construction costs. Modifications were being made to those reactors that were on order and under construction in the 70s that added to their construction times and added to delays. In the 1980s, because of all of this sharp rise in construction costs, there were 130 cancellations. Also during this time, and as a result of the 3 Mile Island incident, the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations was created. And in with it came significant and sweeping changes associated with operating the nuclear reactors. In the 1980s, 48 reactors started up. We moved to the 1990s, and this is when you start to see a maturing of the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations and focusing on equipment reliability. In this period, the maintenance rule from the NRC came out. We went into reliability-centered maintenance and predictive maintenance. You have the preventive maintenance basis database was created, and 3 reactors started up in the 1990s. 10 reactors shut down, and once again, those 10 were from first kind of generation test reactors. There was not really a commercial viable plant that was shut down at that time. When we move into the 2000s, and we've got AP 913, which if you don't know, is really a equipment reliability guidance document for the industry. Also in the 2000s, now we have deregulation, merger and acquisitions are going on. There were increasing O&M costs due to the focus on equipment reliability. And it was interesting at this period of time, as a part of that mergers and acquisitions, this is when a lot of the fleets really started building. And you had a number of plants that were sold at rock bottom prices during this period of time. And what we saw, and that was the early 2000s. Now in the later 2000s, electricity prices were such that it made nuclear very, very profitable. So at the end of the 2000s, the mid to later parts, the nuclear industry was very profitable. And that was due to the economics of generator of nuclear associated with the price of electricity at that time. Now, in the later part of the 2000s, and we're getting into 2010, natural gas prices, because of fracking, dropped significantly. The natural gas supply is very large. That dropped natural gas prices. And now we got to a point where nuclear could not compete anymore with natural gas plants. And you saw a number of natural gas plants come online in the 2010s. You see also there that there were 9 units shut down prematurely. Now, this is where we actually have the economic impact where nuclear cannot be competitive, and 9 of these units shut down in 2010. Now, going back, when I talked about coming out of 3 Mile Island Unit 2 and into the 1980s and 1990s, where we're really focused on reliability, we see that we really did our job. We did our job well. Our performance, our operating performance, when you look at everything except cost, is outstanding. Greater than 90% capacity factors, 10-fold reduction in core damage frequency. From an IMPO standpoint, our highest performance on record. Oversight from the NRC, fewest NRC performance issues, and our margins across the goal were 100 times safer than required by the NRC. There was just exceptional safety culture and reliability that occurred in that 1990s associated with that. But once again, when we did this, we weren't looking at cost or value of some things. So we see that costs were rising with that performance, that there was a price to pay for it. Now, if you look over on the right-hand side, we see that, going from 2002 at about $30 per megawatt hour, we see a steady rise up to 2012. And it was this really at this point in 2012, and combined with natural gas plants starting to come online because of natural gas costs, the nuclear industry realized we have to do something. So about this time, you start seeing optimization programs going on in the different utilities and across the industry. There was, when we looked at it, we saw there was no thought put into the value of some of the improvements. In this drive to increase reliability, we often had a more is better type of attitude, meaning that, let's say that the tires, if I try to use an analogy with your car and the tires on your car, if those tires, their lifetime is rated at 50,000 miles, well, we got to a point where it was like, hey, let's change them out at 25,000. And we realized that we didn't look to see, was that providing any value to us? So in 2012, we started to work on items to reduce the cost. Now, what we found, though, is that as you see in this table to the right, we got some performance improvement going from 2012 to 2015, but it wasn't enough. So in 2015, you have a number of natural gas plants online. Electricity demand is flat, showing marginal growth. Solar and wind are rapidly expanding their base, and the electricity markets failed to recognize the value of nuclear energy's clean energy attributes. So we started to see premature plant closures simply due to economics. And there goes the need for the DMP initiative. That in 2015 is when the Nuclear Energy Institute came out with the Delivering the Nuclear Promise. So here is that Delivering the Nuclear Promise. It was to assure the future viability of the industry, strengthen the commitment to excellence and safety and reliability. And it's always a foremost thing that we will not impact safety and reliability. This initiative was driven by the chief nuclear officers, and it had all U.S. utilities were committed to supporting it. Now, the process that was created as a part of the Delivering the Nuclear Promise initiative was first to look at what are our largest cost centers. The chief nuclear officers evaluated where their money was going. And what we found was that you had a couple of big bins: maintenance and site services, operations, licensing, security, engineering, and radiation protection. So the CNOs designated that industry committees would be created, and that the utilities would team these industry committees. They would fill the committees. And the committees that were created originally were in the areas of work management, work execution, corrective action, training, engineering, security, rad protection, regulatory, and preventive maintenance process. These committees got together, and once again, it was met with, there were representatives on these committees from the utilities, from IMPO and EPRI and NEI. In some cases, there were NRC representatives. Each committee was to look at their particular area and develop efficiencies that could be put into place in that area to reduce cost. And the result, the deliverable, the output of these committees were called efficiency bulletins. And in these efficiency bulletins, it described the particular process or issue and how to implement a plan to receive benefits from executing this bulletin. So these bulletins describe the actions to reduce cost while maintaining safety and reliability, and they're available to the public. They can be downloaded at the link that I show here. And if anyone ever has any problem accessing those, you can get in touch with me. But it's a very friendly website. And if you just go to nei.org, there will be a Nuclear Promise tab that you can access and get right to those. Now, I list some of those efficiency bulletins, and I have in red here some of the very effective and important efficiency bulletins. You see the one at the top, transform the maintaining the plant organization. That was really looking at revitalizing our plant organization in engineering and maintenance, operations, streamlining those as a part of the 1990s that I was talking about, and that focus on reliability. Besides doing more, like with my example on the car tires, we also would just add more people. We added a tremendous amount of people in that period of time. And now looking at it, we saw where there were a lot of optimizations that could be made to change that organization to be more effective. And that's what that efficiency bulletin reviews. The second one down, value-based maintenance, is really looking at the aspects of what you get out of your maintenance and your preventive maintenance. So for example, in the case of the car example that I gave with the tires, when you start to change something out at a frequency more frequent than it needs to be, what happens is you induce additional errors. There can be in those tires, with any quality control, there will be some manufacturing defects. So if you're replacing your tires more often than you need to, you have the possibility now of putting in a manufacturing defect. There's a possibility that during the maintenance, a lug nut problem or something associated with that, and not balanced correctly, all kinds of things that when you do maintenance that you don't need to do, we actually found that you not only have increased your cost, but you've decreased your reliability. And I think I have a graph on that to show in a few minutes. But that's what value-based maintenance is. It's optimizing your preventive maintenance so that you're getting the most value out for the amount of cost. And finally, another one I point out here was critical component reduction. What we found during that time is we had identified a number of components as being critical, which means that they have higher requirements on preventive maintenance. And we identified a number of components as critical that didn't need to be. And once again, you see that when you do that, if you label everything as critical, then nothing is critical. So when we went in and started to look at this and refine our critical components, we found that there was an improvement in safety and reliability by identifying those that weren't truly critical and getting them out of the critical population. So let's see, how did we perform? Coming from 2015 to today, implementing those efficiencies, how have we actually performed? So this is the latest information. This was updated in February of this year. It has the 2019 results. And you see that when we look over to the right-hand side, the realized reductions are at 32%. So we reduced our megawatts per hour by $14.15. The Delivering the Nuclear Promise Initiative goal originally was a 30% reduction from the 2012 cost. So that's what everything is judged against, is the 2012 cost. And we see that as of today, we reduced by 32%. Now, one thing that I'll say along those lines, so going back, the one thing I'd like to point out here is when we talk about, and when you hear maybe other people in the industry talk about this 30%, 32% reduction, I'll point out that that is an average across the industry. When you look at, I talked about the 95 reactors at 56 sites and the different utilities. As you look at the utilities in the United States, some have been much more aggressive than others. So when you look at that 32% as being an average value, there are some utilities that are much, much greater than 32%. I mean, 40% type level. So a lot of it depends on how aggressive different utility was in addressing these efficiency bulletins and taking the actions. I mentioned about the function of reliability and cost. And this graph here shows what we found. You know, if we look at that 2012 value, where on the vertical axis is O&M cost, we'll see that as we actually reduced our cost, we actually improved reliability. And this goes from that factor that I was talking about of not doing maintenance that didn't have a value, that either didn't improve reliability or in fact negatively impacted reliability and was costing us money to do. So we see that as we got better in identifying our critical components and the right maintenance to do, we not only reduced cost, but we improved our capacity factor, which I'm using as a function of reliability and safety. You see that as of 2019, we're over 93% on capacity factor. So where do we stand? There's more work to be done. If you look at the figure on the right, you can see that that range of our cost range to be competitive. This is where we are competitive with a natural gas plant. And you see, quite frankly, as I talked about, those really aggressive utilities are within that range today. But as an average across the industry, we still have a ways to go. Um, and we need to work on those operating costs to reduce to get to that future goal that you see on the far right. So more work to be done. Now, besides what we can do internally, I did want to just point out so that everyone was aware, there are a number of states that have recognized the value of nuclear and the importance to climate change and CO2 reduction. And here are more than 9,100 jobs that have been saved from state actions. So you see these states, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, have all taken actions to recognize, at least to some extent, the value that nuclear brings to their state and to the climate. So a couple of final things. The big lessons learned from DMP, that right maintenance on the right equipment at the right time maximizes reliability and minimizes cost. When you look at the efficiency bulletins and how you could group them into bins, it really comes down to processes, organizations, and technology implementation. Those are the keys. Each site needs to evaluate for their own economic metrics the right balance of plant risk for maintenance cost. And then finally, it's so key to implement technology and automation. I think, as you all know, the nuclear industry is far behind any other industry in implementation of technology. It's a slow process within our industry, and it's something that we have to really get after and attack. So with that, that concludes my presentation. And David, back to you for questions.
Chris, thank you very much. First of all, we'll ask our audience if they will unmic and if they have any questions with regard to nuclear promise or your responsibilities at EPRI. We'll give them just a couple minutes.
Hi, Chris. This is Drew Peebles with Kairos Power. Thank you for the presentation. I was curious if you had any sense for a lot of the plants delaying a lot of their large capital projects to meet the nuclear promise. Do you anticipate it being difficult once those capital projects are eventually implemented? You know, are they going to struggle to keep that cost down at the 30 or so % reduction in cost?
Yeah, you know, I don't think so. I think I don't think you'll see any kind of bump up. You know, I think in many ways what you're asking is, did we just delay the inevitable? And I don't think so. When you look at reduction in capital cost, I think it's more of a right sizing of looking at when should we do these large capital replacements and just making sure that it's done right and smart. There's an EPRI program called Integrated Life Cycle Management that looks for, say, a particular fleet where, and let's say, I don't want to mention any particular fleet, but one of the US's large fleets, they look from a corporate standpoint at their main power transformers and when to schedule the replacements, you know, how to schedule those out. And it's amazing the tens of millions of dollars that you can save by just sequencing your changeouts correctly. So when they used a program from their original plan to this optimized plan, there was tens of millions of dollars that utility saved. So, you know, I don't think there will be this bump up increase from, say, later on that we're putting off the inevitable. I think that we're just being smarter in those replacements.
Great, thank you.
Chris, what is the cost expected to be for the SMRs, like in comparison with the ones you just presented for the large nuclear plants?
what is expected to be the megawatts per hour cost of an SMR?
Yes, that's right.
I was involved when the SMR first started being talked about 2 to 5 years ago. I was involved, and I'm trying to clear the cobwebs and remember what the values were. I haven't seen recently where the SMRs are on where they're at on the dollars per megawatt hour. So I don't know. I better not just guess there. I can't pull it up in my head, and I'm sure they've made improvements since I was involved with working on them. So I'm sorry, I don't know. I have to take that as an action.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Chris, this is Dustin Martin. Just curious if you guys have taken any time to look into how flex ops have affected capacity factors and cost per megawatt calculations, or if that's considered as a part of that.
Yes, no one has. No one's taken a look and done a study on that, but your thinking is right. What we're able to do is take credit for flex in a number of situations and reduce some. You can use a risk-informed approach, and reduce some of your preventive maintenance on equipment. So I know some utilities have done that, but I'm going through my head here. Even NEI has not taken a look to see what kind of gains we've gotten out of that. So where would be a utility who is utilizing that? It would be seen in the results that are being reported to the different organizations like NEI and EUCI, but they're not distinguishing what came from flex. So we wouldn't really be able to tell.
I know we have folks on from the labs. EPRI has been a leader with regard to delivering the nuclear promise and advancing nuclear processes and protocol. I'm interested in whether the labs, we have Savannah River National Lab, we have Oak Ridge on, whether the labs have been involved in supporting the nuclear industry also. So if you could unmic and share a comment if you have one.
This is Lisa Ward from Savannah River. Yes, we collaborate with EPRI on a few instances. A lot of our current on-sites in relation to nuclear energy are sort of after the fact fuel, taking care of what's a bit thereof. I am interested in your discussion of optimized maintenance. We'll say changing tires at 25,000 instead of 50. I really want to use that idea in relation to our sort of conservative safety changing out of things at the lab. I'm definitely going to suggest that, for instance, glove box gloves are good for 2 years, but we change them out every year. Based on conservative safety, understanding, and never really believed in that. They're marketed and tested for 2 years, and I think I'm going to push it based on your discussion, and maybe you can back me up with some emails if I get pushback. But thanks for your time.
Yeah, it's hard with something like gloves that there's not a maintenance aspect where someone could make a human error in replacing them, and the defect issues that come with a piece of equipment. So that's a tough one you have there. You know, one of the other examples besides a car tire is filters. What we saw in the industry was that on filters, you would replace this filter, and an engineer, the recommendation on the filter was replace it every 3,000 miles, we'll say, or 3 months. But when our workers would go out and replace that, they would find it in pristine condition, and it would be in there that it was like brand new. So why are you opening up a system and taking a risk and putting some new component in when something was still pristine? We utilized the feedback from our maintenance practices to be able to revise those preventive maintenance tasks.
Lisa, thank you for that. A question for the nuclear service company. I know we have Framatome on. So the Nuclear Promise Initiative has been with us for some time. If you could share for us how that actually rippled back through the utilities and into the service community, and whether and how it changed the way you do business, we'd appreciate that. So anybody from Framatome would care to weigh in?
David, can you hear me without too much echo?
Yeah, you've got a fair amount of background. Give it a try. We'll see.
All right. Yeah. So I'm in actually business development for Framatome and do a lot of proposals in Duke, FP&L, Exelon, Entergy. All of those are my main customers as far as refuel services. And I know that when this thing first came out, there wasn't a whole lot of understanding and stuff to it. It was just everybody assumed all of our prices needed to be cut by 30%. So which kind of really helped us out, and it was kind of frustrating, to be honest with you, because everybody's coming back saying we want price cuts, but at the same time it forced us to design the cost and do redesigns and do some projects to really reevaluate how we do things and be a little more efficient, to try to help out the plants and stuff. So it was definitely it was a big learning curve, right? But at the end of it, just made us better.
And let's hear from the utilities. I know we have both Duke Energy and Dominion on. You were on the front lines, both with regard to delivering the nuclear promise. In fact, both of your companies, I believe Chris will attest, were very prominent in working with the national associations and promoting the concept. So if you could relate to us what you saw at the plant level, I think that would be instructional also.
Yeah, so this is Jerry Moore with Dominion Energy. We definitely in 2015 incorporated Nuclear Promise and did a lot of items, did a lot of research and work, value-based maintenance and run to maintenance. So we're not touching the equipment as much or as often to save costs. We also challenged our vendors. We challenged the processes, deleted PMs. So we've done a lot of work, critical components, identifying the critical components. So we do less maintenance. I will say, Chris, that we have the DNP, or the Nuclear Promise, seems to be fading in the distance. We talk less of it. It's almost like we've went through that wave and we're beyond. But I know we need to refocus and get more attention and get more savings. But in my mind, some of those processes have just been incorporated, and we do them routinely now, as far as the work order feedback. So maybe it is something we need to revitalize and talk more of for as a maintenance level or organizational level through the station. But thank you for your time.
That's a good point. I thought about that too, that I haven't talked about where it's going. And you're absolutely right. If you look at the efficiency bulletins, actually the latest one that's out was there was one in 2019. So right now, NEI is looking at where do we go from here? And that's really still kind of being worked out. We have a going forward strategy, but it's being looked at again right now. So for the most part, you're absolutely right. DMP is essentially done and over. You won't hear anyone else say that, but at this point, they're just kind of taking another look at, okay, what's the next step?
To kind of elaborate on that, at Harris, I know we went through a significant effort. You know, I was on the front lines with that when it came to revising PMs and all of that. And there was a lot of time and effort that went into that. And then we realized that to really get where we're going, we needed to go even further than that. So come with cuts and, you know, various things. And we've achieved the goal. And I think, you know, with time, as energy costs continue to come down, we're going to have to continue to look at those things. But at least on my end, what appears to be the biggest dragging piece of it is the willingness to accept the risk that comes with that. We talk a lot about cutting PMs. We talk a lot about, you know, making critical components non-critical or run to maintenance, et cetera. Accepting the fact, and that's across the board when it comes to our leaders within the company, leaders within the industry at IMPO. The biggest challenge seems to be the fact that when you have a component failure and it may have some minor consequence to the plant operation, that we have to accept that that's what we signed up for when we went through some of this. And I think that's the piece that we're missing or is struggling to catch up with all of the changes we've made.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I'll tell you, because I was involved with this from really the beginning, and I ran one of the committees, we had an efficiency bulletin that addressed that exact issue. In fact, we presented to the NEI committee that we felt that issue that you just brought up was the enabler for anything and everything else, that there needed to be a culture change, that, you know, we had the culture of zero tolerance for failures, and you know, that we needed to change that so that the engineers, you know, knew that they weren't going to be called onto the carpet if there was a failure of a component, that that we reclassified and we characterized as, you know, it's okay to fail. It's okay to run to maintenance. So to get that culture and that thought change at the upper levels of management to then, you know, make sure that they gave the individual engineers the confidence that, you know, they weren't going to be, it wasn't going to be held against them. That was, you're absolutely right. That's a tremendous point. And we tried to get that out, and it never caught on. We were asking the CNOs and the site VPs and the plant managers, and created some communication videos to, you know, sit down with their people and make sure that came across. But that's an area that we failed, I think, as you just mentioned. One other thing too, I will say, since we had both Dominion and Duke personnel speak up, those are two of the utilities where, if you look at their final results on those DMP initiatives, they are way above. They're well above, is the way I should put it. They're well above the 32%, because those are a couple of companies that were aggressive and were really looking to make changes, and they did.
Chris, I'm going to give folks a last opportunity to pose a question to you. So anybody online right now have a question for Chris on nuclear promise or anything generally he's responsible for at EPRI? Also, thank you, Chris. Excellent presentation.